It's like watching the middle part of a movie and going, what would I go back to the first part of the movie and tell this actor what they should have done in the first scene?
I really am pretty happy with everything I've done over the last decade.
I wish that I could have sat down with the 22-year-old kid and said, now look, perseverance is what gets the glory.
I like the Lamarr that exists today. I'm not sure I would like another version. This is who I am. This is who I deal with. I'm happy with the outcome.
I wouldn't really change much. I wish I'd lost the weight sooner.
I would probably encourage myself to be a little bit more relational and seek out friendships over trophies.
Otherwise, yeah, I'm super happy with everything I've done.
What about you? Would you change anything in your past?
I love that guy in that video. He's like, I'm super glad with everything I've done in my life. Like, I think he's got to be the only person on planet Earth that thinks that, right? It's just like, how can you say that? Well, welcome. If you're visiting with us this morning or if you're watching or listening online for the first time today, my name's Scott. I'm the lead pastor here at the Bridge. It's a joy to welcome you. Hopefully you've had a good experience so far. Hopefully you continue to have one. Hopefully it's not all downhill from here. Hopefully we can still continue on and have a great morning together. We're concluding today. This is the fourth message, the part of four of a series called What If? And so if you're kind of coming in on the end of that series, you haven't kind of been a part of any of that. The whole idea for this series and what we've been talking about for the last 3 weeks is this idea that I think one of the reasons many of us, I think, don't experience the change that we would want to experience or the change that we would want to see happen in our lives is because for many of us, we don't allow the question, what if, to simmer long enough in our lives. We don't allow the question, what if, to sober us long enough, to really take a good, hard, long look in the mirror, to really evaluate some things in our lives. We just don't do that. We don't allow the question, what if, to really sit with us long enough. And the minute that it begins to kind of, we begin to feel it, the minute it begins to kind of sit heavy on our chest, the minute we start to kind of really start seeing some things in us or about us, many of us try to switch gears as fast as we possibly can. And we try to think of something else, we run to something else, many times we run to someone else. But the whole idea for this series and what we've been talking about for the last 3 weeks is getting to the place in our lives, for all of us, regardless of how young you are, how old you are, is to get into that place in your life where you allow this question, what if, to sit. To allow that question, what if, to simmer, to really let it sink in long enough, to allow some things to come to the surface, to see some things in your heart, to see some things in your life, to evaluate some of the decisions you've made or some of the decisions you're on the verge of making. Many of us have had that moment, especially this time of year, where you're driving and your car swerves on the road, right? And you kind of regain control of the car, you get control of the wheel, and you kind of have that heart thing like, oh my goodness, there's that, instant of like, right? What if you hadn't have regained control? What if you'd gotten caught? What if you had started? What if you hadn't have started? What if you had said yes? What if you had said no? What if she saw your web browser history? What if you hadn't gone home with him? What if you had stepped out in faith? Or what if you hadn't have stepped out in faith? See, those questions, what if we really let them simmer long enough, they can bring some things to the surface that we have to pay attention to. And again, one of the reasons we don't experience the change in our life is because we don't pay attention to what that question, what if, reveals in and about us. And so for the last few weeks, we've been looking at a famous story that's found in the scriptures, and alongside of that story, asking the question, what if? Now, the story we've been looking at, it's a story that many of you, if not all of you, have heard of at least once in your life. My guess is you've heard it a number of times in your life. My guess is there are those of you that are like, if I have to hear this story one more time, I'm going to lose it because you've heard it so many times. It's a story that ends like this. It's found in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 50, and this is how the story ends. It says, so David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. And again, most of you, if not all of you, have heard this story of David and Goliath, and because you know already how it ends, rather than talking about how it ends, we've been talking about what if. What if it had ended differently? What if David had made some different decisions along the way? If he had, the story wouldn't have ended the way that we know that it ended, and the story wouldn't be the story that you know. And the reason today is so important, the reason this entire series has been so important for me and for you, I believe, is because it's not only a powerful story, but asking the question, what if every single day of your life, you are living another page in the story of your life? And even though we know that Goliath goes down in the midst of David's story, you may be wondering if Goliath goes down in the midst of your story. And see, we have the luxury of reading 1 Samuel 17:50, but as we've been saying, David did not. David never read 1 Samuel 17:50 when he stepped out on the battlefield. He had to live it out in the face of uncertainty. And even though you've heard 100 sermons about how David defeats Goliath, as we've been saying, there are 3 things that David faced before he ever stood in front of Goliath. And over the last 3 weeks, we've looked at each one of those 3 things, asking the question, what if? What if any one of those 3 things had gone differently? And if they had, it wouldn't have ended the way that we know that it ended, and the story wouldn't be the story that you know. We saw back in week 1 how David's father Jesse gave him a simple task of taking some bread to his brothers down on the battlefield. And we asked the question, what if David had been a typical teenager? What if David had tripped over the ordinary? What if David had felt slighted because he was asked to do something that he thought wasn't a big deal or wasn't that important? And where we kind of left off in David's story after week 1, where it landed for me and I believe landed for you, is that opportunity presents itself as ordinary. And that's why it's critical for you and I to be mindful, to be present, to be faithful, to be obedient in the midst of the ordinary things in our lives, because that's what allows the door of opportunity to present itself. And because David embraced the ordinary, he was one step closer to a moment in his life that would define him as extraordinary. And in week 2, we saw how David had to face an offense before he ever faced Goliath. That when he got down to the battlefield after the Israelites had been there for 40 days, David shows up late to the scene, and his oldest brother, Eliab, was jealous of him. And when David shows up, Eliab questions his heart, questions his character, questions his intentions. And we ask the simple question, what if? What if David in that moment stands there and argues with his brother? What if for the next 2 hours, David tries to defend himself to his brother Eliab? Eliab wasn't his enemy. Eliab wasn't the giant. Eliab was his brother that he was supposed to fight for. And so the takeaway from that week for me, and I believe, again, the takeaway for you, is sometimes you're fighting against what you're supposed to be fighting for. It could be in your relationships many times. You're fighting against the very people that you're supposed to be fighting for. And those fights, those arguments actually serve as distractions in your life. They distract you from fighting and warring against the things in your life that you should be fighting and warring against. And it takes courage and it takes a moment just to press pause or to have a timeout and to turn away from those distractions and then kind of look and say, you're not who I'm supposed to be fighting with. You're who I'm supposed to be fighting for. And then last week we saw how David finds himself standing in front of King Saul, and he offers to go out onto the battlefield and fight Goliath on his behalf. And rather than celebrating or rejoicing over the fact that David is willing to go and fight on the battlefield, Saul actually provides David with another battle that he has to face. Saul points out that David is only a boy. And so we ask the question, what if in that moment David listened to what he was only and he turned around and walked away? What if he stands before the king and he's like, you're so right. What was I thinking? I'm such a fool. Thank you for being so wise, King Saul. I would have got my head blown off. Like, what was I thinking to think I could go out and fight a giant, that I would actually have a chance of winning this fight? What if? What if he had listened to what he was only? Better yet, what if you were to listen to what you are only? Because when you look in the mirror, you know what you're only. You know what your only is in your own life. And if you don't, my guess is, like David, you have some wonderful people in your life who will be quick to point that out. But what we left with last week, just to kind of catch you up last, it says, your only is a platform for God's presence and purpose to be put on display in your life. Your only is a platform for God's presence and God's purpose to be put on display in your life. And since David didn't cower or flee or run away because of what he was only, he actually embraced it. He embraced what he was only, and he shed what he wasn't, and with him he took a sling and 5 smooth stones, and he ran on to the battlefield. And so we have ordinary, we have offense, and we have only. And if David trips over any one of these 3 things, this story, it isn't the story that you know. And if you or I trip over any one of these 3 things, our story isn't the story that we want to tell, no matter what it is that we're up against. Now, today we're going to continue on in David's story as we conclude this series. And as you know, Goliath goes down. And even though we've already looked at that a number of times, I just want to look at that verse one more time. 1 Samuel 17:50. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and he killed him. There it is. But it's so much more than that. In fact, this isn't even how the story ends, though I know that's what you may think it is. I know that's for some of you what you remember seeing on the flannel graph all those years ago. For some of you, you remember the story ending this way. But that's not how it ends. And what I want to do today is rather than just asking the question, what if something had been different in David's story, I actually want to, for this last message, kind of flip the thing over and ask a different question. What if you could discover in your life the very thing David is about to discover in his? What if you could discover in your life the very thing that David is about to discover in his? And see, as we've been saying throughout this series, David never had the luxury of reading 1 Samuel 17:50. But there are those of us who have never read or have never heard 1 Samuel 17:51. And because we've never heard or never read 1 Samuel 17:51, we don't really know how the story ends, even though we think we do. And because we don't know how it really ends, we miss the power and the perspective that we see in David's story that all of us need as we try to live out our own stories. So, David takes the slingshot, he hits Goliath in the head, and Goliath goes down, and he's stunned. He's stunned, and so we think it's over, but it's not over. David has something else that he has to do in this moment. And for some of you, you're going to love what happens next because this is going to bring back memories for you, for those of you that are video gamers, okay? Anybody, you a gamer, video gamer? Prayer meeting for liars is Wednesday nights. No, seriously, for those of you that are video gamers and you know who you are, especially if you played video games in the late 90s, the early 2000s, you remember this game called Mortal Kombat, right? And there was that game, and at the end when you had your enemy, your opponent on the verge of defeat, there would be this booming, deep voice that would come over the speakers and say two words. Do you remember what those two words were? Yeah, finish him, right? And these like amazing Old Testament tone, like finish him, right? And see, the problem is for many of us, we're content to simply stun our enemy. And what I mean by that, it's kind of a weird way to say it, but for many of us, I think, we're content to simply come to church week after week, and we come in for about an hour or so and feel good, at least hopefully you feel good, and you come in and you grab some free coffee that's not bad, you shake a few wonderful people's hands at guest services, you come in, you sing a few songs, you listen to a message that's hopefully encouraging, uplifting, motivating, maybe, hopefully, it's helpful, the content is helpful in some way, and you hear all those things, it might even make you think, yeah, I should think about that, yeah, I should consider that, maybe I should do that, but then you walk out the door and you forget everything that you heard. And you go right back into the same stuff, right back into the same cycle, right back into the same way of thinking, the same pretending, the same image management. We're content just to feel good for a little bit. And David finds himself on this battlefield, and he's like, I didn't come out here to feel good about hitting him in the head with a stone, and I certainly didn't come out here just to stun my enemy. I came out here to finish him, right? So that's where David finds himself. And as you read this, again, and one of the things I would encourage you to do as you read your Bible, I know for many of you, you think, man, reading the Bible's tough. It's hard to really get into it. One of the best ways to get into the Bible is to put yourself in the sandals of the people you're reading about. I tell you that all the time. And when you do that in this moment and you start reading about David, you got to think, what is he thinking in this moment? Because he's in a moment, he's in a situation, in a circumstance he never intended to be in. He's probably, if he's anything like me, he's out on that battlefield thinking, how did I get here? Like, I was just bringing cheese and bread to my brothers, and here I am now on this battlefield. And again, you have to remember, he never intended to fight this giant. He didn't even know this giant was present. He had no intention of being here in this moment. Never did. But he was obedient in the ordinary, which opened the door of opportunity, and then he had to fight through an offense. He had to embrace what he was only, and as a result of those three things, he finds himself on a battlefield where he has just stunned a giant, and now he has to finish him. And as I've read this story, I don't know how many times I've read it, maybe as many times or maybe double the amount of times that you've heard it, I've read this story over and over and over again, and every time I've read it, I had this thing where I think, poor David, like, he was just the errand boy. He was just the delivery boy. He was just bringing cheese and bread. He was skip the dishes David, right? He's just an errand boy. But then you read this, and the more you read this, the more you realize David isn't the delivery boy. Goliath is. David is not the delivery boy. Goliath is. What did Goliath have that David did not have, that David didn't know that he would need? It's right there in verse 50. He gets to the battlefield, and watch what it says, without a sword in his hand. Spoiler alert, he left with one. Who was carrying it? His enemy. What if you could see that the giant in your life has got your sword? What if you could see that the giant in your life has got your sword? And if you want to see victory in your life, you are going to have to face and finish whatever that giant is in your life. And the good news for you, and the good news for me, the good news for all of us is that you do not have to do that on your own. David didn't. As we saw last week, David said, I'm bringing the same God into this valley that I brought into all the other valleys in my life that I have faced. And so it says, David ran and he stood over him, meaning Goliath. He took hold of the Philistine's sword, he drew it from the sheath, and after he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. David's a bad man, right? I mean, he's a poet and all that stuff is wonderful as you read Psalms, but he is a bad man. He killed him and he cut off his head. I used to read this all the time, and I thought that 1 Samuel 17:50 was the final sequence in the battle, when in reality he wasn't. David gets there, he stands over him, he takes the sword out of the sheath and he kills him, and then he cuts off his head. Why? Because he needs a trophy. And why does he need a trophy? Because Goliath would not be the last giant that he would face. And see, I've always read this and thought that this was the end of it, right? That this was how the story ends. I mean, how much more final can you get, right? How much more savage can you be, right? I mean, the giant goes down, the giant dies, he cuts off the head, it's over, right? No, it's not. No, it's not. And see, I think for many of us sometimes we think that we know. Maybe you think that you know how your story ends. And see, I think one of the reasons we get so caught up in that idea and caught up in that mentality is for many of us, we mistake the ending of a chapter in our lives with the ending of our story. And they are not the same thing. The closing of a chapter in your life is not the same as the end of your story. And I know for some of you, you've been in that place in your life where you're like, man, we did this and we did that and we tried that and we went to church and we went to that counselor, we read that book, we watched Dr. Phil, and we still ended up getting a divorce. And you think your story's over. But that's not the end of your story. That's not the last time you can be loved or love someone else. That's not the end of your story. And the reason I know that is because I know who wrote it. What I mean is when you read through the scriptures, specifically in the New Testament, you find the writings of a man named Paul, who was the godfather of the early church. And he wrote letters to believers in numerous cities, and many of those letters actually became books in what we call our Bible. And when you read the book of Hebrews, Paul writes, he says that we should focus our eyes on Jesus, get this, who is the author and the perfecter of our faith. And then he writes to a group of people, a group of believers in a place called Philippi, which in the Bible it's known as the book of Philippians. So this letter, and in that book, he says that he, meaning Jesus, he who began a good work in you is faithful to complete it. So if Jesus is the author and perfecter of our faith, and if he is faithful to complete whatever it is that he begins in us, you can close a chapter in your story, but that does not mean it's the end of your story. And since I know who Jesus is, no matter what it is I'm up against, no matter how big the giant is, no matter how long the battle rages, since I know who Jesus is, I'm going to leave this battlefield with something having been developed in me. I'm going to leave this battle with something having been stirred up in me. I'm going to leave this battlefield with something renewed, something affirmed in me. I'm going to leave this battlefield, no matter how big it is and no matter how bad that giant is, I'm leaving this battlefield with a testimony, with a story to tell. And you'd be amazed at how many people I've met in my life who have gone through unbelievable grief and then released their greatest gift from out of that grief. And what I'm hoping that you'll see in David's story as you live out yours is simply this. Your giant has got your sword. Your Goliath has got your sword. And someday down the road, you're going to be sitting across the table from someone, maybe 5 years from now, and they're going to need it. And you're going to be able to say to them, look, I've been on the same battlefield that you find yourself on today, and I just want you to know that that sword that was meant to destroy you, that sword that was meant to kill you, will actually be the sword that God will use to deliver you. Think about it. David killed Goliath with his own sword. That's hilarious. David killed Goliath with his own sword. Your giant has got your sword. But it's not over, because it's never over. You can close a chapter in your life, but that does not mean the story is over. The story goes on for David, just as it will for you, no matter what it is you're up against. And so David takes the sword, Goliath's sword, after he kills him, and he sends it to the temple at Nob. And there's a man there by the name of Ahimelech who is the superintendent. And some time passes, and eventually David finds himself in Saul's palace. And Saul, if you read through the story and you get to, 1 Samuel 17 or 17:21, you get to the point where you see that Saul is eaten up with envy. He becomes so jealous of David and his success and the way people view him that he actually gets to the point, Saul does, where he tries to kill David. So David's on the run. David's got to take off. David's got to get out of there. He's got to get out of Dodge. He just, as fast as he possibly can, he's on the run. And like sands through the hourglass, these are the days of David's life. He's on the move. He's on the run. You have to understand this. He's actually running from the very king that he had fought for. And you see, Goliath was not David's last giant. And you do not want to stay in one moment of victory in your life for the rest of your life. You don't want to get to the place in your life where you look back at your past and think, my best days are behind me. Again, as you continue to read through the scriptures, what you see is that God brings us, it says, from glory to glory, from strength to strength. And what that means for you is no matter what you've been to and no matter what you've been through, your story is not over. The chapter may have closed, but your story is not over. And I know for many of you, you look at yourself in the mirror and you think because of your age, your best days are behind you. And now life is just about surviving. It's not about thriving. And you think, what's left for me? The best days? That's not true. And if you stay stuck in that mentality, you will miss out on some of the best things that I believe God has for you. That no matter what age, no matter what stage, your best days cannot be behind you, because that does not sound like the God who we serve. That if you're still breathing, you still have purpose. There's legacy for you to leave and impart. There's still things for you to learn, and you should get all you can and can all you get and pass it on. There are many of you, I think, that can make the biggest difference by leading a small group that we're talking about. That in that moment, you could actually sit down with a group of people. Maybe you've been married for 50 years. What could you leave? What legacy could you impart into a group, into a generation that statistically is not going to make it? You have something to give. You have something to leave. Your best days are not behind you. You could actually be the very person that gives hope that the best days are still ahead of certain people. And so Saul is on the hunt for David, and David takes off. David's on the run. And once again, he's thinking he's got to survive. Goliath, is a distant memory, one that he's not thinking about at all, because right now all he's thinking about is, I got to get out of here, and I got to figure out a way to survive this. He's up against a giant. And he's on the run so quickly and so fast that he doesn't have time to gather his belongings or gather his bearings. He's just got to get out of here. And so he gets down to the temple, and that's where we kind of follow on in David's story in 1 Samuel chapter 21. And here's what it says. David asked Ahimelech, he gets to the temple, don't you have a spear or a sword here, right? And I know for some of you today, you need a sword. I know for many of you today, you need a weapon. You're going through something right now and you need a weapon. You need a strategy. You need an insight. You need a reminder. You need an encouragement. And David finds himself again here at this temple talking to Ahimelech. He says, don't you have a spear or a sword? And he goes on and he says this. He said, I haven't brought my sword or any other weapon because the king's mission was urgent. Now, David being David here in this moment, he's trying to keep Ahimelech from having to make a decision that goes against the king. So he's like, the king sent me on he's trying to protect Ahimelech. But the bottom line is David finds himself once again in a situation where he does not have what he needs. But you know what's there, don't you? I don't even have to tell you, do I? I don't even have to read it because you know. Why is it we can see so clearly when it's not us? Why is that? He says, do you have anything? Do you have a weapon? And the priest said, the priest responds to him. He says, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here. It's here. Goliath's sword, or what used to be Goliath's sword, is here. It's right here. The very weapon you took from your enemy, the very strength you gained from what you survived, the weapon that you took from Goliath is right here. And he says, it's wrapped. It's wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. And if you want to take it, there's no other sword here but that one. It's right here. It's here because you took it from what you faced back there. And so David says to Ahimelech, there is none like it. Give it to me. So David takes it. David, who started with a sling and leaves with a sword. And the reason he has the sword now is because he took it back then. He takes into his next battle what he took from his last battle. And even though he closed the chapter on Goliath, his story continues to go on, just like your story will continue to go on. And I know that there are those of you that are just wondering, how long is this chapter going to last in my life? How long is this season going to last in my life? I'm exhausted, I'm tired, I'm frustrated, I'm angry, I'm bitter, I can't take it anymore. How long is it going to last? And the answer is, I don't know. And I don't know the details of what you've been through and what it is you're going through. But here's what I do know. Here's what I do know. If you will be obedient in the ordinary, if you will be faithful and mindful, present and obedient in the ordinary, in the things in your life that are day to day, and if you will turn from those offenses in your life that are meant to be essentially a distraction in your life, those offenses that will take your time and your energy and your emotion away from what it is you really got to fight through, if you will turn from those offenses and if you will embrace what you are only, you will face a giant in your life that will define you. It will define you and it will propel you forward with purpose and perspective that you would not have had you not gone through what you had to go through. But it won't end there. I'm sorry. The story will continue because that's the way that it always does. There will always be another giant for you to face. There will always be another fight. There will always be another battle. But the good news is you will be more prepared for that next battle because of what you endured from your last. To put it in another way, today's giant holds tomorrow's sword. Today's giant holds tomorrow's sword. And speaking of swords, as we kind of close out today and as we close out this series, I want to leave you with something that I've been praying all week, that at the end of this series that you would leave with this held in your heart. That if at the end of this series, if you could walk away with one thing, this is what I'm hoping that you will walk away from what you see in David's story as you live out your own. What I want you to leave within your heart this morning as you're about to dust yourself off and head back out onto your battlefield, no matter what it is you're fighting and warring against. Here's what I'm hoping you'll hold on to. It's written by the prophet Isaiah. It's found in the book that bears his name that's in the Old Testament. It's a very famous passage of Scripture. But I'm hoping that it becomes more than words on a screen. It becomes something you hold in your heart. And here's what Isaiah says. It says, no weapon that is formed against me shall prosper. It doesn't say that the weapon won't be formed. It doesn't even say that the weapon won't be present. But Isaiah said, that weapon will not prosper. And so you and I have a luxury that David did not have, in that we get to read 1 Samuel 17, 50, 51, and beyond. We can read Isaiah 54, 17, and we know something that David did not know, and that is that Jesus Christ came and defeated sin, death, and the grave. And because he lives, I can believe and be confident that even when I don't see it, he's working. And even when I don't feel it, he's working. He never stops. He never stops working. And those words are more than just catchy lyrics to a song that we sing every now and then. They're words that you can be confident of and hold in your heart, that even when I don't see it, he's working. And even when I don't feel it, he's working, because he never stops. He never stops working. So no matter what it is you find yourself facing on the midst of your battlefield, no matter how big that giant in your life is, and no matter how long it's been coming against you, whether it's been 40 days or 40 years, you can be confident that you are not alone, and that the giant in your life holds your sword.